Welcome to this edition of the Training Wheel. Today, SCR Form 138 Transaction Brokerage Agreement. This was a little trickier because it can be used for buyers or sellers. Typically what would happen is think of this as a one-time showing agreement on steroids. It has kind of like a one-time showing arrangement with it, and it also has compensation in it. There's lots of different scenarios where this can be used. So I'm going to give you a couple of things in terms of scenarios on when it would be used. For example, if you represent a buyer, or the brokerage represents a buyer already with a full-blown buyer's representation agreement, and maybe you know of a seller that would sell their property, you can't go to that seller and represent them as a client. Remember, transaction brokerage agreement is a customer-based relationship. You could, however, use the SCR Form 138 as a customer-based relationship form, kind of like a one-time showing agreement. You could then go to the seller and say, hey, you told me a while back that you might be willing to sell this property. I have a buyer client who might be interested in this, and you could perform a transaction brokerage agreement with that. Another way to look at it, or another scenario that could happen, would be that perhaps you represent the seller as a client. Maybe you're holding an open house. A buyer walks in off the street. Now, at our company, you can't represent the buyer as a client because that would put you into a designated agency situation. That can't happen. And we don't allow dual agency where you go to the seller and go, we're going back from client to customer. What you can do, however, is a transaction brokerage agreement. That's a perfect scenario for transaction brokerage agreement. That's where you notify the buyer, go through the South Line Disclosure of Brokerage Relationship forms, of course. Notify the buyer that, hey, I represent the seller, our brokerage represents the seller, and that the buyer is represented as a customer and a customer only. That's a perfect time to use an SCR Form 138. So let's talk about walking you through a transaction brokerage agreement. Of course, you clearly have the parties and the broker on there, and it tells you the purpose of the agreement. You can see where it's the purchase or the sale of a property. At the Boulevard Company, you shouldn't be doing leasing because we don't allow property management services, so you can kind of skip that part. You would pick and fill out under the address, the tax map number, list price. If you're representing the buyer, then have the seller tell you what they want as a list price, because you can't give client-based advice to the seller. If you're representing the seller, then you already know what the list price is, and you can put that in for the buyer. If it's for the purpose of purchasing, you can indicate a range, put a description in there, or remember, this is typically for a one-time showing type of arrangement. You also have the ability to put compensation in there, whether you're representing a buyer or seller. You can fill that out appropriately. Keep in mind that you really need to go over with the customer what you can and cannot do. You can use skill, care, and diligence to facilitate the transaction. You have to be honest and fair, provide accurate information, but you can't advise. That's a client-based representation. You have to disclose material adverse effects actually known. You have to do that under any scenario, so keep in mind you have to do that in here. And you have to keep information confidential as requested in writing by the customer. Now, I can't say I've ever seen a customer put in writing, keep the information confidential. Best business practice, just keep the information confidential. Once the customer signs it, broker signs it. Now, you don't need my signature as broker in charge on that. You, as an agent or a brokerage, can sign that.